Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the last leg for the valiant participant in this conference, to the last leg and last morning of this conference. I think it's important to start with one big expression of thank you to people who have done an intense 8-hour moderation yesterday. So I want just a big applause to the 3 moderators. And actually also to those of the note takers that have been kindly offered and provided to us by our Canadian interlocutors. If they can stand, for those of them who are in the room, there might not be a lot, but there might be sleeping, yes, absolutely. So I think it is important. The other thing is that you worked on the basis of documents that, as you know, were prepared during the contact groups, and I want to express gratitude to those of you in this room who have participated in the contact groups and who have spent, again, many hours in virtual meetings from around the world. So, final congratulations to all of you for the intense work that has been conducted yesterday. It was very exciting to see the intensity of the people in the room, and I must say that walking in the corridors at the end of the day when the sessions ended and hearing the clapping emerge from the different rooms at the end of your discussions was extremely rewarding for us and for me in particular, because it displayed a certain spirit that I think was exactly the objective of this meeting. So with this, it is time to allow the moderators to present where we have established the mission and the objectives for the way forward. The revised versions of the work plans that you have finalized yesterday will be distributed in a semi-final polished version by the end of the morning, and the full outcome will be distributed next week. But I want to allow them now to give the sense of what was accomplished in their respective work streams, because most of you have participated in one track and are certainly interested in knowing what has been cooked in the other ones. So, Wolfgang, if you want to launch the exercise with the content and jurisdiction track. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And in all modesty, we were the first to accomplish the aim, and so we were clapping first. Thanks so much to the group. That was marvelous. It was a great variety of regions and stakeholders present, and not only present, they were all engaging in the discussion, which was really great. And so what we have done is based on the discussion of a very, very broad range of stakeholders, and including many, many regions of the world. We all shared the feeling that the material, the one-pager that was the basis for our discussion, it was an excellent basis to do that. But nevertheless, we felt that some changes and additions should be made so that we have a common understanding, a common objective for the next month, and the roadmap to Berlin. And in the following minutes, I will just focus on the points that have been especially intense discussed during the meeting and that were important to the stakeholders present. The first thing, and I think that's something specifically tricky in the content track, is to find the right balance. On the one hand, it's all about jurisdiction, what we are discussing. On the other hand, we see that it is interconnected with many issues around content governance as such. And it was important to us to make sure that we do not lose track here, that at the very beginning of our section on objectives that we state that the fundamental aim is to define workable jurisdictional interfaces. The term is not defined, we are aware of that, but nevertheless the group found that we can go with this interface metaphor and this term. And I think it well reflects what we have discussed in the first plenary round here when we talked about the mission of the whole Internet and Jurisdiction program. So that's the first thing that we said, having in mind that you have from time to time to broaden the perspective, that the focus is on these jurisdictional interfaces and workable jurisdictional interfaces. The second change that we discussed and agreed upon was what is actually what we want to do. In the text was the term clarification. There was identification in some issues, and we thought our mission is twofold here. First, it is to identify the situation as it is, the existing norms, the hierarchical structure of the norms and things like that. That is the basis, but that's not enough, of course. The next step is something that we put in two terms. One is clarification, and the other is that we are looking for coherence. And so that are the things you will find overarching the specific objectives that we name. It's about clarification and coherence, but we have to identify what is at stake. We have done a lot there. We are not starting at point zero here, of course, but nevertheless, I think it's important that we found this overarching aim. And then we have rephrased a little the suggestions of 5 objectives here. All is based on what was in the original paper, but we added at the first level, where it's about the stock taking, about substantive norms, that the regional human rights should be taken into account as well, not the universal human rights. And the second, it was important to us to state that we want to separately discuss the roles and obligations of states and private actors, both, but to keep in mind that they are fundamentally different, even if there is an interplay between both in that respect, and that when we talk about private actors, we talk about responsibilities, but also about protections by human rights, and that has to be taken into account. In the third objective, we broadened the scope a little and said that it is not only about decision making, it's about standards and procedures. That's the 3 things we are interested in. And the fourth point, where it's about the geographical scope of restrictions, it was important to us that all the things that constitute a proper test, whether there is an infringement of human rights or not, are taken into account, and that is a legitimate purpose as well as necessity and proportionality. So I think that's an important aspect as well. And the last but very important point is the due process and transparency standards. That's a specifically important aspect to us. We had a discussion, and some in the room felt very strong about that it is important to stress the role of innovation and flexibility of rules. That we have not included that in the wording is not because people opposed that. I think the feeling in the room was that that is indeed extremely important. But the structure of the aims was a different one that we had, so it was hard to include that without changing the structure completely. But I think there was an agreement in the room saying that when we are talking about standards here, then the necessary flexibility to make innovation possible is of extreme importance. We then turn to the structuring questions, and again, thanks to the Secretariat and the work that has been done between Paris and Ottawa, many of the structuring questions we felt were exactly the questions we should be working on in the next couple of months when we are coming to Berlin. We made some additions here too that have to do with taxonomies and possible work we can do there that is helpful to many stakeholders, including courts. That is first the type of content we have. Can we find characteristics and take into account intentions and possible effects, and discuss what are appropriate measures for addressing different types of content. So that's one additional fundamental issue we think we have to address when we go forward, and we felt that that is important because we believe that these kind of taxonomies can make a difference already in the short term. It's not just about things on the horizon, but it's something that a court can use immediately right now as soon as we come up with good arguments how to differentiate between different content types and argue whether a specific measure is appropriate for content type or not. I think that can be extremely helpful, and we felt the same way as regards types of actors. So that's an additional question as well that partly reflects the discussion we had in the plenary at the very beginning, where we saw that in the chain of delivering content, you find a great variety of players with completely different roles, and some are more content related, even if they are not acting editorial, but some are more on the technological side, and to find a typology here is a question we want to pose to us for the next month, because we believe that might be extremely helpful. We made some changes in the language regarding the other points. We believed that some were a little bit narrow. When it's just about the detection of content, we changed that and said we are interested in decision making, and especially the architecture of decision making, including the role of the different state actor types and private actor types. So that's one of the questions we put in here. When it comes to algorithms, we are not only interested in the combination of the algorithmic tools and human decision making, but also the inherent conditions that come with specific algorithms. Things like overblocking, for example, is a thing that has to be addressed according to our deliberations we had yesterday. When it comes to the geographic scope, which is one question, we want to address the very, very specific and very central question: how should a private entity react when they are contradicting demands by different state actors from different countries? That could be a very good test case for what we can actually achieve. I think that's most of the things we have discussed. That was not easy, as you can imagine, and it was not easy in your working stream as well. And so what I found extremely helpful was that in the last hour we had, because we were so fast, we decided to talk about specific test cases, critical cases. And what we actually started is a kind of critical case collection, partly cases that are real cases, or at least have similarities with real cases. Some are more test cases that we have invented, completely different types of cases. And what we already in this 1 hour could see is that those cases help to see where can we make a difference, what kind of institutional arrangement can help solve these problems. We have made this list. It will be made available to all of you, of course. It's not only interesting to the content group, I would say. And we already started looking for instruments that could help solve the problem in this case. For example, when states engage in new legislation about social media, for example, then some guidelines from the group might be helpful. In other cases, where courts decide, it's more about the typologies that we come up with. And again, the discussion turned to how to integrate courts. Can we make use of the great experience that UNESCO has in training judges and learn from their experience, and you can see there were very, very concrete first steps already visible. So that's what I wanted to say, with a big thank you again to the group that it was possible to agree on this language. There was the temptation, especially for the lawyers in the room, of course, to fall back into the negotiation mode every 15 minutes. But we reminded ourselves that it is not a treaty, it's about questions, it's about objectives. And so I'm very happy and thankful that the group could finally agree to these points. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I'm glad that the basic documents that you worked on were a good support. And I think the last point that you mentioned, which is trying to inject concrete cases, either existing or real ones or hypotheticals, is a very good methodology when we discuss things like how would people react. And this is something that I remember was done in one of the conferences that was organized in Stanford by Daphne Keller. There were hypotheticals that were shared, and it demonstrated the complexity of the decision making on every single type of case. So it's good that you mentioned this. With that, with no further ado, can I ask Martin Botterman to give his feedback on what was done in the domains and jurisdiction workstream?
Sure, thank you. Very much so. A very intense and long day, as you said. And I have a great admiration for all those people who were in the room with me and stayed in the room with me to almost the very end. So, very active participation of a good mix of stakeholders, those who need to act when it comes down to domain takedowns, and those who are affected by it, governments with their opinions on their needs expression, recognizing obviously the challenge of going across jurisdictions. A very generous contribution from very knowledgeable participants, both from technology, from legal, but also from business and from government. Couldn't have happened without them, and it was very much larded with real life experience to get real, because that's what it's about. It's real challenge, it's not easy to solve, but we need to get real about it. The groundwork that is done by the Secretariat following Paris has been highly appreciated as well. Very good to have this starting point that is progressing over time, that we can build on. And obviously the challenge is there's always new people in the room that need to be getting up to speed, and it wasn't a problem. Also, these were very willing to listen rather than to pose, and also to ask questions which were welcome and integrated, because it also helps us to get away from the kind of spirit that you get into as a group sometimes, understanding each other very well, but for an outsider it's difficult. That's the advantage of bringing newcomers in. it's about real issues, and one of the challenges is not always well understood in the room, but also outside of the room. And that is an explicit point that deserves as much as attention as how to do it itself. Final conclusion, more work to be done. We talked about the objectives first, and the objectives as presented by the Secretariat as a starting point. And what we found is that there's slight changes in emphasis, which is really based on progressing insight. That is really about interruption of domain name, because there's much more than a takedown. Interruption reflects better that it's more than one thing you can do. And that it's about takedowns without the consent of the registrant, because in many cases with good-willing registrants, it's easily dealt with without going through difficult hoops. It's about what actions should or could be done by domain name operators that are willing and able to exercise, recognizing that it's not the same level of operators. There's different operators. You got registries, you got registrars, you got resellers. Where's the action to be taken? We also moved away from, I think that's the biggest change, from the concept of notifiers to the concept of notifications. And yes, it's about the notifications being right. And who is the notifier is an important aspect of that. But it's not about the notifier itself, because even with trusted notifiers, it's still about the notifications. And these notifications can be, and that distinction was important to add, we felt, either for information or for action. So there was strong support for the following notions that were expressed already. First, interrupting the DNS is in a way a very blunt tool to address abusive content or behavior. And it's really a means that doesn't change it, it just takes away the identifier that helps you find it or get in contact with it. So sometimes it's extremely useful. An example is spam mail that gets people to phishing sites. If you remove the link to the phishing site, then that spam mail becomes more harmless than it was before. And other examples is of registrars being asked to remove domain names on second level, but these domain names would carry much more content than just the abusive content, also from many more people. So is it then appropriate, proportional? So proportionality is key and not always well understood. What would be the impact of a specific action required should be made very clear. There's a recognition of the strong differences in governance between the country code TLDs and the generic TLDs. Whereas the generic TLDs are more or less under one framework, find themselves an ICANN on how to behave together. The CCs are subject to primarily to their national government. It doesn't mean they're not participating in ICANN debates. It doesn't mean they're not open towards good practice in general, but it's two different regimes, or I should say more than 200 different regimes, from which one is only ICANN. So, and as you said, due process is key. We need to do this right. It's not about flinging it. It's really about due process as well. There were also some changes in emphasis. I mentioned already moving from notifiers to notifications. Another one is more emphasis on measures to make it doable and scalable for the executors. Whereas a lot of money has been made in the domain market, the margins per domain are often very small. Meaning that if you want to kill the domain market, you should put on very high demands that are costly. And mind you, €1 per request is already a burden that takes out the profit for some time. So make sure also that the measures are appropriate for the purpose that relates to the kind of abuse means different measures are more effective in different ways. And the proportionality, as mentioned before. In the original paper, we talked about abuse of content, but we really should stretch that to abuse of content and behavior, because sometimes it's not the content, but what it triggers to be included. And whereas the focus was on the content and behavior then, infrastructure abuse and registration abuse should not be forgotten. It's different level, and that's why we didn't focus on that. But many of the tools and the methods and we talk about for the more content-focused abuse also relates to infrastructure abuse and to registration abuse. New points of attention that were not yet in the material, but I'm sure it will be, and it is also a good ground for more work to do. First and for all, education. Education, the first example that was given was to policymakers that make legislation, that require things in legislation that sometimes don't make sense immediately. So does it help? What is the impact? And we should be there to make sure that legislation is doing what it's intended, rather than being badly informed. And there were examples of these kind of interactions that in a way lead to better legislation as well. For courts as well, that court orders, obviously you should obey, but not blindly. Sometimes court orders are not appropriate or proportional, and then it makes sense to go back to the court and say, do you realize what you're asking here? And beforehand, maybe also make more judges aware of what the impact of specific requirements that they can put upon actors is. Law enforcement agencies, many people are very knowledgeable in law enforcement about what it means, but not all. And sometimes basically stupid requests are made, and then we can say it's stupid, but it's about helping them out. What needs to be achieved and how can it be held best? And maybe the DNS solution is part of the solution and maybe not, but let's get clear on that. And also towards notifiers. Notifiers can be professional organizations who are set up to notify, but it could be anybody in a way. And it would be good if we also make clear to notifiers, so if you're trying to be useful, which information to bring, how to make sure that we can do something with it. And last but not least, and that's a general thing in the use of the internet, is registrants. What can be expected, ranging from the life cycle of domain names to what happens if I get in trouble. Another point for action here that we see is the collection of resources that are available, make them available, maybe even production of those to stimulate that to happen, ranging from a short video to, there's a lot of good material already, but people don't find it. A very good example was somebody pointing out an ICANN generated document with some excellent information, and we asked in the room, so how many are registrants? Almost everybody. And how many had seen that document? Let's say that was less. And this was a room of people who are interested in this stuff. So you can imagine how much more lever we can get by getting the information accessible at the right places. The other point that was brought forward is there's things we can't do because they're not scalable, because it's difficult, but that doesn't mean they never can be done. Tools can help. So it's about development of tools that help, that enable effective measures, proportionate measures, and scalable measures. In a way, WHOIS is a tool too here, and it was recognized that it's important it can provide rapid access to those who need to have it on a legal basis. So that continues to have attention. And point of action towards the Secretariat or towards all of us, maybe to solicit registrars, registries, law enforcement, and maybe even the intelligence community on the capabilities and information they need to access certain data. What information, what are they trying to achieve, and how can it be well served? Build in the process of due diligence in this, of course, built in the tool. The two-way communications with the requester, referring to existing tools with operators and with other operators and market providers. Minor points. Notification can be for action or information in the provision, as I said. Keep in mind all levels of abuse, as measures may be relevant for all. So also the infrastructure abuse and the registration abuse, even if you keep the focus rightly on content-related abuse. And then there were some practical things on how to bundle some of the sub-points of work. Final recognition is that court orders are basically the things that we follow. And court orders can have two origins, and it matters whether a court order comes as a result of MLAT action or whether its origins from the country itself. So let's explore more what the differences between those and the difference in how we can deal with it as well. In summary, the actions, obviously to update the document to reflect the discussion, and excellent notes have been made by the people who assisted in that. As you said, they've done a great job too. Do the inventory of the education needs and what materials already available. Develop a taxonomy on urgency. So how urgent is certain level, a certain kind of abuse, the severity of abuse. And be very clear and focused on establishment of what could be considered sufficient due process for acting on notifications. Let's get that clear. Let's get crisp clear, not only for those in the room, but for the world. And establish what is considered good practice, as much can be done on initiative already, which happens in the infrastructure abuse for a large part. But what can be done? Let's get clear on that as well, and that can only be done when acting under a court order. And then last but not least, the inventory of challenges for which tools are necessary, and maybe which tools are already available for that. And I'd love to ask people who were in the room whether there's any additions that I've forgotten or misrepresented, because we didn't go over my final notes yesterday night after the dinner anymore. Then I think that's it. Thank you very much for your support.
Good morning. I'm Peter Swire. Did you want to introduce
Yes,
yourself?
no,
okay,
absolutely. But I would like just to make one quick comment on what Martin was saying, and it was also the case with what Wolfgang was introducing before. What I think is extremely important to note is that sometimes a very minor change in wording has a very strong consequence in how you address a problem. The change that you made between focusing on basically accreditation of notifiers versus the quality of the notification, irrespective of where it comes from, I would strongly encourage the people who are dealing with the data stream to also keep in mind this change, because this is also related mentally to the question of accrediting or acknowledging countries to be part of a regime, or validating the requests that are made by a country, or both. So I think it was also another element in the discussion that struck me, is that there was an idea that was floating, which is that, interestingly enough, the domain track is at the same time addressing things that are related to content and to access to data information. So it completely illustrates what was said at the beginning about the diversity of actors. The registries and registrars are also one type of actor in the whole chain of actors for delivering content, for storing data, and so on. So it's very interesting to see that in as much as we have separated the three tracks so that the stakeholders can discuss their own problems, we need to keep in mind that breaking silos between different processes is one thing, but we shouldn't reintroduce silos within this very process, and always try to make the links between what is discussed in one room and what is discussed in the others. Just wanted to say this because the change from focus on notifiers to focus on notification is exactly the kind of value add that we hope to provide, that the groups really think about what they mean behind a particular word. So with this, Peter Swire has the floor for the data and jurisdiction stream.
Thank you, Bertrand, and thank you to everybody who participated till 6:28 p.m. yesterday in the data stream. That gave 2 minutes to walk to the bar for a much-deserved break after the full day. So we really stayed focused, and almost everybody in the room participated. I feel like it was a very full discussion. I'll give some preview before we talk about the changes. Our track is driven by factual changes. So by one estimate from an EU member state country, half of crimes now have digital evidence. And if you think about how often crimes might be, the digital evidence might be held by service providers in other countries, the scale of the challenge for access to data just pervades the law enforcement reality going forward. And this hasn't been well solved yet, so that's what we're working on. To give a sense of what's going on, the update of what's happening in the area took about 2 hours. So we just did what's going on for 2 hours to try to get everybody to understand it. And I'll give you a 6-point summary of that. The first is the European Union is working on an e-evidence directive. And as a sign of urgency, yesterday morning they released information about the draft, taking what can be seen as quite an extraterritorial position similar to the United States Department of Justice. So if extraterritoriality is one of the words here, now we have the EU and the United States having official positions that push towards extraterritorial reach for data. And also, all of the 6 things I'm saying are new since Paris in 2016. Second, in the United States, there's been legislation called the Cloud Act introduced in recent weeks. It is a close match with the framework that we've been working on here. The elements in the Cloud Act closely match our work with this group. And then beyond that, besides just merely passing legislation to change everything, yesterday the US Supreme Court had its argument in the Microsoft Ireland case. We got a report from Professor Andrew Woods for that, and I think a fair summary is he thought Department of Justice probably won from the whole thing. That might overstate what he said, but that's a short summary, which would lead to a sort of broader reach of US Department of Justice if they succeed towards getting data from others. So that's the EU, that's the US. Number 3 is the Council of Europe, the Budapest Convention. They are now actively working on a new protocol for sharing of data across borders. And estimate from one person in the process is likely to have text in the next year or 2. So the work we're doing here will feed into that process. Number 4, Africa. We had a very full discussion from the African Union representative, and they are working with the Council of Europe on many of these same issues. So countries that hadn't always been participating, now they're actively discussing the same issues. 5th on the list of current activity, I'll put Brazil and India together as 2 large and important countries and markets where there's active, quite strongly felt views on this, where there's a lot of frustration from Brazil and India about the status quo. And so how to resolve that will be important. And then a 6th update was for Asia, for East Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and others, where data localization measures are in the process of being put into place, often driven by tax for over-the-top taxation reasons, but then the data would be there for law enforcement access as well. So that's a pretty good review of the world: Latin America, Asia, Europe, the United States, Africa, whoever I forget left out, I apologize. But this is happening all over the world. In terms of our ability to talk about it, I think I felt, and I believe the group felt, we had the right set of a range of stakeholders. We had people geographically diverse. We had people from the different parts of government, service providers, civil society. So I believe that we've got a very wide range of perspectives. And then that fed into something we did near the end on what's the calendar for the next year or so. I've told you some of that, Council of Europe and EU and US, but the calendar took another almost an hour to go through of what's going on in the area. And none of us can go to all the meetings on all the continents, I promise you. But that leads to a reason for our work. These issues are very complicated. They're hard to get your hand on, even if you work on it all the time. The documents we're creating here is an attempt to have a multi-stakeholder, well-informed, balanced set of what are the issues to consider. And I hope that maybe from the discussion we have here in the next round of paper, as people go to all these different fora, they'll have a template of what needs to be discussed so that people don't leave important things out. And I think that's an encouraging thought for the relevance of what we're working on. Later today, you'll receive a printout of the edits to structuring questions, and you'll receive a printout of topics identified for work going forward. I will not read the 15 structuring questions or the 13 topics for further work, but I'll select a few of them that came out of the discussion yesterday. So for structuring questions, I'd say there's 3 that are brand new. One is, and apologies to the group, I added these words this morning, but I think it reflects our discussion. So we have a bullet point saying that there has to be both qualifying regimes and qualifying requests. So there has to be a regime, is this country playing, and a request, is this request appropriate? And so you have to check for each one what's going. Was that a go faster? Or that was an okay point? I'm glad to do whatever you say, okay. A second topic not in our list before was data preservation. At the moment the police are worried about something, they want to make sure the service provider holds the data. It might take a while till the formal request comes in. And so how those fit together is something we raised yesterday. Another strongly felt view is capacity. If we're confused, so is the rest of the world. And so how to have training, how to tell people how they can make the requests and respond to requests, that's clearly something that's going to need a lot of work. I'll mention 2 other changes to structuring questions. One goes to the voluntary or compulsory nature of these discussions. The draft paper was addressed to companies voluntarily producing data. Yes, we're okay, we're allowed to produce it, we'll produce it. That was our issue list. It turns out a very similar issue list applies to compulsory process. If you're designing a regime for when the company must turn over the data, what are those rules going to be? And so our issue list is not just useful for the voluntary part we thought it was useful for, but it's very relevant for debates about compulsory process. And so that broadens the scope of where we apply this. And the last one of the structuring questions I'll point out is the one on authorities. The competent authorities often could be the particular central authority for a country. There was strong interest and, in many ways, acceptance for the idea that subunits of nations might also be a competent authority. Maybe, for instance, a state in a federal system would have a way to participate. Maybe, for instance, a specialized agency with clear procedures would have a way to participate. It's hard to change entire national regimes. It may be easier to change rules around subunits. And so that is a way, among other things, to get scale to more countries than you could otherwise. I'm going to, for the 13 topics identified for work, I'm going to pick out 4 of them for discussion, briefly. The first one is a civil liberties point that's very strongly felt by many in civil society. There should be notification to users when their data is requested. And that is, for instance, constitutionally required in many settings in the United States. But our friend Eric from France pointed out it is illegal to give that notice in France. So the difference between constitutionally required and illegal is quite broad. And so how to talk our way through what the global regime will look like for that is something that needs more work. A second topic that got a lot of emphasis is the size of entities. So small and moderate enterprises don't have full teams in place to handle these issues, but they might have the data. Similarly, smaller countries don't have a task force full of lawyers just working on this issue. And so how to make the regime work for both the small and the major, or larger, let's call it, entities is important. The second to last one on my list has to do with discussion of sovereignty. And this will get the philosophers and Kant and Bertrand fully motivated, I think. But in the working group paper, we did not have a lot of language about prescriptive jurisdiction versus enforcement jurisdiction versus adjudicative jurisdiction. The working group felt to get more concrete in some of the fora, we have to match up with that traditional language of international law. And so how to do that better is a topic to look at. And then the last one, and this might be an invitation for others in the room, it might be something we at Georgia Tech can do or Internet and Jurisdiction could do, is there was a concern there's not good online resources to understand this crazy mess. And so a glossary might be helpful. We had a no acronym rule yesterday, but because there's so many acronyms, people didn't know. But a glossary of acronyms and a set of resources going forward so that not just the short papers from Internet and Jurisdiction, but a series of supporting authorities and discussions, that seems to be something that would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Just a comment for the sake of methodology. In the meeting in Paris, we were qualified by, I think, Rebecca McKinnon as connective tissue for a lot of these processes. The mere fact that you're mentioning all the numerous meetings that are taking place prompts me to raise a point, which is that one, as Secretariat, we are in a certain way mutualizing the information about what is happening in different processes. But the second thing is, most of you will be participating in those processes in one way or another. Any feedback that you can provide or give or channel through the Secretariat on what was discussed there, particularly on whether the different bullet points or the components and the structuring questions, the grid that we are discussing here, was useful or not, what are the elements that were discussed specifically on those meetings according to the respective points, that would be tremendously useful for the rest of the network so that we can gather information and follow up. And the example of having Andrew Woods reporting to the meeting on what was happening on that very moment in Washington is a good example. I love the expression of, if we are confused, then the rest of the world is. So let's try to be as little confused as we can, and maybe the world will understand things better. Very quickly, just like I did for the previous comments, a few things that I really want to highlight as an element of progress or better understanding is the emphasis on taking into account voluntary and non-voluntary regimes, because it seems to go in a direction that particularly the European Union will take something that is not, that will be enforceable and binding preservation or production orders, whereas the Cloud Act is envisaging something that is more on a voluntary basis. The second thing is this word preservation, combining production and preservation of data in the mental framework is extremely important. And the final element is the duality, as I already mentioned, between countries, accreditation in a regime, and specific request validation of meeting a standard. Just one quick remark. Whenever you mention discussions that took place here, remember that the second day was under Chatham House rule. So quote every discussion, but don't specifically attribute. It's important to preserve the safe nature of this. With this, and thank you really very much. It's I must say that it is first great to sense the energy that has taken place yesterday. Just walking from one room to the next, the discussions were intense. I think the results illustrate the quality of the interactions, and honestly, given the diversity of people in the room, I'm extremely, on a personal basis, and as Secretariat in general, we're extremely encouraged by the growing mutual respect and trust that people are expressing. It doesn't mean you have to agree on things, but you have to agree to understand, and you are clearly agreeing and understanding that the position of somebody on the other side of the table is legitimate and has to be taken into account. And I think those elements of the commitment to a common interest, respect, capacity to listen, and so on, and also the dedication, as illustrated by the time you spent yesterday, are values that I think permeate this network and that we want to see spread. I must tell you that a certain number of you know that I've been in this policy environment for internet issues for more than 20 years, and a certain number of you around this room have been in the same journey for 20 years. It's extremely encouraging, honestly. I think this group and the people who are not at this meeting but will take part in this exercise have everything that is needed to produce what we require, or to help produce what we require. And it's really something that I wanted to share, because it's extremely rewarding and sufficiently different from most of the experiences that I've had to say it. That being said, as we have mentioned before, it's not going to be easy. There's a lot of work ahead, but the thing is planned. Knowing what wants to achieve is a prerequisite of success. And I think the objective that was intended in producing those documents is largely achieved. Like, there is a vision of what people want to do, and as I said before, sometimes the modifications of a few keywords is changing the trajectory and making the path available. So, to please the crowd and mention another French philosopher, not that Immanuel Kant is a French philosopher, but Alain was a French philosopher of the 20th century, said, and you may have already heard me say this, pessimism is a matter of mood and optimism is a matter of will. I think we're in an environment that fits with what Jean Monnet, was the founder of the European Union, said, I'm not optimistic, I'm resolute. So fundamentally, that's the spirit that I want to share. We now have a clear roadmap. We have elements to go forward, and I want to quickly first thank you for the confidence put in the Secretariat, and explain a little bit before we get into the Road to Berlin session. What is for us in the months ahead, because as you know, there's more work to do in between. So fundamentally, and in big brushstrokes, the period between Ottawa and Berlin will be divided basically in three steps. The first one is the period between fundamentally now and let's say June this year, where the focus from the Secretariat will be mainly on outreach, socializing the results, explaining what has been done, and that will include webinars. It will include participation in physical meetings organized by other actors, or jointly organizing with a certain number of you meetings with your communities to explain and to socialize this. At the same time, there will be an ongoing discussion for us to help set up what is today generically described as working groups that will take place between June of this year and March of next year. And unlike the work in the contact groups in 2017, which were entirely virtual, the work of those working groups for each of the tracks will be a combination of virtual meetings, but also physical meetings, and the exact number of physical meetings will have to be determined, and the exact methodology that will be followed is going to be set during the period between March and June this year, and we will of course welcome suggestions on how to do this the most efficiently. Because you all know that the narrow path is how to develop processes that are both inclusive and manageable. So any working group has a question of limitation of size and the dynamics and how to include as many people in the process while making it manageable in terms of time and resources. And finally, the period between March next year and June next year for the conference in Berlin will be dedicated to taking stock of the results of those groups, socializing the results and preparing the input into the next conference. So we know basically where we want to go. We know what to do as Secretariat, and we will have also this afternoon, after the closing of the conference at 2 o'clock, something that is called a supporters meeting, but and that will discuss, among other things, the way to get the available and the necessary resources to fulfill this mandate. This is not restricted to the existing funders or the new funders. It's open to all of you, and I really strongly encourage you to come and to help us design how this going to develop afterwards. With this, I pass the baton to Paul for the session on the road to Berlin.
Thank you very much. Maybe before we start, is this working? Yes. Before we go into the final stakeholder plenary session on the roadmap until Berlin, I just want to take the opportunity to also say I am personally really touched by what happened yesterday. There was a certain sense of energy, certain momentum in the different work streams, and I really find it remarkable, and I find that there was really tangible progress achieved because we should not take this for granted. There were really diverse views, heterogeneous actors from different stakeholder groups, from different regions. And so this is just to congratulate you again, and also to say that the progress that was achieved yesterday, let's not take this for granted. I think it was really a great accomplishment. With this, we now open the stakeholder plenary session. As you remember from the first day, we are going to follow the similar procedural rules. That means that the interventions will be limited to 3 minutes. Everybody in the room is encouraged to take the floor. Just raise your hand. The microphone will come to your place. Don't forget to introduce yourself when you take the floor. And as on the first day, we have a number of selected discussants that were selected by the Secretariat in advance. This session is basically about your feedback on the work that has been accomplished over the past 2 days, and also about your aspirations going forward until Berlin and beyond. We would like to ask you, after those 2 days of very intense work, to share with us here in the room the 1 or 2 things that really struck you, things that you have understood better, things that were clarified, or a particular perspective that you didn't take into account before maybe and that you learned here, and pathways towards solutions that basically opened up. And also we want to know, what are your hopes? What do you think after those 2 days of work? What can we achieve together until the next global conference of the Policy Network in Berlin? And this is also a very important question that I would like to add. How does the roadmap coming out of this meeting here in Ottawa relate to the different processes that you either lead or that you participate in? With this, I would like to give the floor to Halim Desir as our first discussant. He's the representative on freedom of the media of the OSCE, and he's also a former French Secretary of State for European Affairs. Halim, you have the floor.
Thank you, Bertrand, for the fascinating past 3-day discussion on a rapidly evolving technological environment which has a lot of effect on freedom of expression and freedom of the media, and which bring a lot of concern for us. It's clear that Internet has given a lot of opportunity for free expression, including in countries where there was no free press. But today, internationally and across the OSCE region, freedom of expression online is threatened as a result of a range of state policies on blocking, filtering, removing, and monitoring of content that is deemed unlawful, and the undermining of the principle of the open internet itself, as well as intermediaries' decisions to remove content, whether upon the request or demand of state authorities or on the basis of their own community guidelines. That was very well explained. There is here two issues, two questions. The first is it proportionate? Is it balanced? Is there unwanted impact on freedom of expression? And the second, very basic in some countries, is the issue of abuse, because it's clear that it can also be used just to stop dissenting voices, opposition voices, by the government, which will just claim that they do the same than everywhere. They try to combat hate speech, racism, or extremist content. So we think that this discussion is very much needed. We underline, and that was, I think, for us also one of the lessons of the discussion, the need of a common framework which will bring together the states, the civil society actors, the media themselves, the internet intermediaries, even if the courts, like the European Court of Human Rights, are wondering what is exactly an internet intermediary, but all the stakeholders together. And I think this is absolutely necessary, otherwise we will have an addition of inconsistent regulation and as a result a fragmented and very incoherent internet. So my conclusion, it's not a conclusion, but I would say that in the lead-up of the third Global Internet and Jurisdiction Conference in 2019 in Berlin, we should offer three basic recommendations. The first, in terms of methodology, is the value of this inclusive, participatory, transparent and multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance and the development of policies and solutions which will protect freedom of the media. The second is that international human rights principle drawn from Article 19 of the Universal Declaration and Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights must provide the rational and human rights framework upon which policies and solutions should be based. And the principles of legality, legitimacy, necessity, and proportionality of any restrictions on freedom of expression must be the starting point of discussion on how we secure a free and safe online space. And the third is the role of dedicated international governmental mechanism, sorry for the time, namely the three special rapporteurs on freedom of expression, the UN, OAS, and African Commission, and my office for the OSCE. In a global policy development discussion, their role are essential, and such mechanisms, which are established upon the will of state within their respective system and with common commitment to international law, have, I think, a key role to play in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Sisi Maribel de la Peña Mendoza, who's advisor to the presidency of the Republic of Mexico. And I also want to highlight that Mexico currently has the presidency of the ELAC process. Sisi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much for inviting us. Conversations were extremely useful. We, as Paul mentioned, we are here with two hats. Mexico, within the National Digital Strategy, the President, Enrique Peña Nieto, he just was very determined with the telecommunication reform, to make a big transformation in the country towards digitalization. And given the framework of all the vision that we have, we are also leading the digital agenda for the Latin American region. Now, we faces as a state, we faces challenges on how the internet has influenced the social development, not only on the social level, but also in the economy level. How we develop, how innovation has come forward through the internet. And this is something that we need to be very aware of. So what are the challenges that we are now facing as a country to allow our citizens to develop in this new framework? So we know that this is a very complex issue, We know that content and data protection and cybersecurity are the basics topics to develop to go into these frameworks. We need to face the challenges or develop public policies that address these issues. We currently are facing these issues actually in a commercial level when we come into new trade agreements. Let's call the trade agreement with NAFTA, with European Union, with Argentina, and all these new components or how we face the liability of intermediaries are placed into these chapters for digital trade, and I think this is a challenge that we as a country and as a region need to face now. So thank you very much for these conversations. Are going to be very, very useful. We want to get more involved in the conversations. We want to have a higher voice, and we basically want to see what is going on in the world around it, because we realize we are not the only ones facing these challenges. We see an extremely difficulty in how to address them. This is a dialogue that needs to be open to society, but we as a governments cannot look behind, or can we not close to these complex issues. So this is a great path to identify what we can do as a country and as a region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those remarks. Next in line is Chris Despain. He's the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of ICANN. And I also want to highlight that ICANN is one of the institutional supporters of this conference. And before I give the floor to Chris, I'm starting to take also people for the speaking queue, so you can already raise your hand and I will write down your positions. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paul. Wow, there's a lot of work to do. All of us are going to need to find ways, I think, of getting work done intersessionally, and I'm delighted to hear that Bertrand has got some thoughts about how we're going to do that moving forwards, including his suggestion of us giving feedback to the Secretariat when we attend other meetings. But it's also important as we build towards Berlin that we all contribute intersessionally rather than just waiting until Berlin and turning up and going, I have an idea. In the tradition of honouring Bertrand, I'm going to make 3 points, all of which I think are practical and hopefully helpful. I spent the day yesterday, you might be surprised to hear, in the domain name stream, and I'd like to see us do a little bit of work to try and un-ICANN that group. I don't mean not have ICANN a part of it, but I don't want it to become simply a mini ICANN discussion. We need to be more conscious, I think, of having input from law enforcement, from folks who are likely to be non-law enforcement users of any mechanisms that we may come up with, and indeed registrants and consumers, users of the internet. My second point is about crossover. There are, and it picks up on what Bertrand and I had a chat about this earlier on today. It picks up on what he said. There are many crossovers between the domain, track, and data and content. Infrastructure abuse is clearly a technical issue in a discrete area, and it could be argued that abusive name registrations are also a discrete area, but the content abuse area that we covered is clearly closely related to the content and connected to a subset of the content work that's going on the other stream. And who is data is clearly a subset of the data stream, especially now that GTLD, who is moving from a wide open database that's accessible by anybody to a different structure. So I think we need to check in at this stage to avoid duplication and possible divergence of solutions for the same or similar problems. And I'm not sure how we do that, but I think we need to do it, and we need to do it before we do too much more work. And my third and final point is on the physical meetings that you mentioned intersessionally, and it's just an offer. If ICANN can help to facilitate those by leveraging off of our meetings, having said I want to un-ICANN the domain thing, I'm now inserting ICANN, but if we can help in any way to leverage off of our meetings to help you run your physical meetings, we'd be, I'm sure, delighted to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. With this, we open the floor basically to everybody in the room. Who would like to go first? Well, can we have a microphone with Win, please? Thank you.
Never pass up an open microphone. It's Vince Cerf again from Google. I wanted to make, first of all, I have to say, I spent the day with the domain meeting, and the level of energy and willingness to engage was very encouraging. There is an enormous amount to be gained in what we're doing here, and there is also an enormous amount to be lost if we don't succeed. I hope everybody is feeling very motivated by that. I wanted to bring up something which I tried to express yesterday in the domain meeting, and that is that we are easily trapped into thinking that everything is the web. And some people might think I'm trying to beat up Tim Berners-Lee or something, but I'm not. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there is more to the internet than the web, and that we shouldn't allow our thinking to be narrowed unnecessarily by the mechanics of the World Wide Web, because there's a lot that goes on in the internet, a lot of functionality which it produces or supports that is outside of the web domain. And it's also the place where new things happen. So is the web, because it's a platform as much as the internet layer is. But I hope that we are careful as we work our way through these issues to keep that in mind. The other thing I wanted to mention is the infrastructure attacks that use the domain name system as a mechanism for attack. One of them is the reflective attack, where you essentially send fake queries to the domain name system, but the source address of the query is the target of your IRE. And so the response that comes from the domain name system goes to the target, which was the fake source IP address. So if ISPs would just implement BCP38, which says, check to see whether or not the IP address of the packet you're sending into the net actually comes from among those IP addresses you're responsible for, then we would get rid of a certain amount of asymmetric attack in the net. Another thing that we should be worried about is the possibility of overwhelming the root zone by simply launching denial of service attacks. We know that there's at least one attack that was 500 gigabits per second. So we know that the bad guys are capable of generating that kind of traffic. You could wipe out a lot of the root zone that way, in spite of the fact that we have multiple copies of the root zone everywhere. So there's one other very interesting possibility, and that is to install in every single resolver a copy of the root zone digitally signed, so that it has access to the best data. We should think about things like that, because we would eliminate a potential bottleneck in the architecture of the system. And I'll stop there because I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go next? Please share with us your takeaways from yesterday and your aspirations for the roadmap to Berlin. Who would like to go next? Otherwise, I go back to our pre-selected. Oh, behind me. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Michaela Neal, Black Knight from Ireland. I suppose the thing is really a case of what are the deliverables from this? What are we actually doing? Are we just talking a lot, or are we coming up with concrete tools, documents, plans, standards, procedures, whatever? You know, I was in the domain thing yesterday with quite a few other people, and you know, there were certain things that we were talking about that we'd been speaking about in both here and other fora on and off for years. So I think it would be helpful and easier for us, for those of us who are engaged, to continue that engagement if we're able to look at concrete deliverables. Principles are fine, but in the real world we need something that people can actually interact with tangibly. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Could we have a microphone for the gentleman over there in the back, please? Is it who's? Yes, and please stand up so that we can, if the camera catches you.
the Hewlett Foundation. Just to really say thank you to the Secretariat and to all the participants for their hard work. And as one of the supporters of this effort, just to really say that one of my aspirations is that this effort continues and that a diverse array of funders and collaborative partners come together to really sustain this effort. Because part of the reason why the Hewlett Foundation is providing support is that this really is the connective tissue. It is a key venue where critical conversations are happening about some of the most pressing policy challenges facing the globe in the internet age. And so really just to say that as a nonprofit philanthropy, we see a real importance and a real mission to this organization and are very pleased to continue to support it and really hope that other supporters and partners will step forward and join with us on the path to Berlin, because I think it is a critical time to provide the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network the resources it needs to continue to keep marching forward and to really make the progress that we're all touching upon in the comments today. So just to say thank you and to really make a call for others to hopefully step up and not only attend but also to support this important effort.
Thank you very much, Eli. This is very much appreciated from the point of view of the Secretariat. Thank you. Could we have a microphone over here, please? Yes.
Steve Delbianco with NetChoice. And by way of responding to Michele's question or query about where do we go from here as far as deliverables and steps, my day job and mission at NetChoice is to keep the internet safe for free expression and free enterprise. And that day job continues, well, every day in many states, countries, and venues around the world. So Michele, while we are in parallel asking the Secretariat to organize and coordinate the outcomes of this thread, I have to believe that the insights, solutions, examples, and rhetoric that I learned yesterday is going to be useful in our day jobs around the world. We can't just simply wait for outcomes of the I&J network in order to be able to improve our effectiveness in the places where we have to fight the daily battles to keep the internet free and open for free expression and free enterprise. So even if the track that the Secretariat is driving is a track that is going to take some time to produce tangible results, there have to be tangible improvements in our effectiveness in everything we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Are there any other people? Otherwise, I go back to our selected discussants. Yes, over there, please.
Was it me? Okay, thank you very much. I agree with the last speaker that decisions and demands are being made every day in the absence of clear frameworks. And the results of this work are urgently needed by governments, by the private sector, and by civil society. And I really want to thank the organizers for including new voices, because this technology is in widespread use all over the world, including in the developing world and in my own country, Kenya. But perhaps more than that, in the face of emerging technologies, we need not only solutions, but also sound processes and sound methodologies for disseminating good practices and for dealing with the challenges that are caused by emerging technologies. So I've been very impressed with the way that this particular process is allowing very many voices to have their 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was Catherine Gitau of the Government of Kenya. Please state your name when you take the floor. I would now like to give the floor to Christina Monti. She's the Head of Sector for Internet Governance and Stakeholder Engagement at DG Connect of the European Commission. And I also want to highlight that the European Commission is one of the institutional supporters of this conference. You have the floor.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to also share some impressions of the last 2 very intense days. If I can summarize, my impression is that we could really see multi-stakeholderism at work on concrete issues. We are used to work in multi-stakeholder environments, in particular in the ICANN environment, where we focus on issues relating to the governance of the internet, meaning the lower layers of the internet. But here I see a very interesting kind of experimentation where we are using the multi-stakeholder approach to deal with issues of governance on the internet, so on other layers of the internet, which are now becoming very important and where we see many issues to be addressed. So the methodology that was used for me was particularly useful and interesting, and I think that the work that we have been doing could not be achieved without the support of a small but strong secretariat, which designed really a process which is, as Bertrand was saying, inclusive but still manageable in order for us to progress. I particularly liked the spirit, so it was so useful from my perspective, for instance, to listen to what other developments are happening in different parts of the world, to engage with stakeholders from different areas with different backgrounds. I particularly liked the fact that, for instance, in the data contact group, we were urged not to use acronyms, so to make an effort to talk in a language that others can understand. And the issue of creating common understanding and to advance on mutual understanding. And for me, the issue of language and of agreeing on what we are referring to is very important. And I heard in many of the sessions that we had the importance of creating glossaries or taxonomies, the idea of having a common language and agreeing on what we are referring to in specific sectors. And this, I think, can work very well with the idea of developing frameworks based on common understanding of what we are referring to, and frameworks also giving the necessary flexibility to adapt to different situation and environments. Because after all, we know that we are dealing with complex issues. We have to approach them, and I think that these could be very, very useful tools. In that spirit, I think also this work is very useful from the European Union perspective. As was mentioned, there is this upcoming initiative on e-evidence for criminal investigations. So this is very much related to the work stream on data. We also had an upcoming initiative on illegal online content, again, very relevant for the group on content. And for your information, for instance, in the impact assessment of the e-evidence initiative, the work of the Internet and Jurisdiction project was explicitly mentioned and referenced. So this is also an example of how different processes feed into each other. And from our perspective, again, the European Union has the ambition to lead in the development of rules for the open internet, and we think that we are pioneering in that respect. For instance, by having the currently most advanced rules for net neutrality, and every time I talk about net neutrality, I get the time is over. So, well, in that spirit, I mean, I think that this work is really useful, and we should continue, and hopefully we will have good outcomes that can be used by other initiatives as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. I would now like to give the floor to Demi Gečko. He's the president of NIC.br, and he was also the chair of the Executive Multi-Stakeholder Committee of Net Mundial. Oh. You have the floor.
Thank you. First of all, I want to enthusiastically thank Bertrand, Paul, and all the Secretariat team for this dense meeting we are just finishing today. I was in the domain track like other people, and I think that all the three tracks got a lot of attention, and there has been an invaluable work in trying to signal the way forward for the future of the internet. And just to remember, Windsurf wrote some days ago that we need to pay attention for the struggle for a healthier, open, friendly and secure internet, and this is the time, and the time is shortening. You have to be aware of. Just to say some generalities on that. First, I want to remember also John Perry Barlow. We lost him 2 weeks ago. Two phrases of Barlow in this. One is the internet amplifies power in all respects. And this is totally true for the good or for the bad. And at the end of the Declaration of Independence of the Cyberspace, he said, maybe may this new civilization be more human and fair. Of course, all we are, think I was struggling in this direction. The way we have to achieve this goal is to exercise things that we do these 3 days here. And this is very, very positive. Just to remember, 4 years ago we had Net Mundial in Brazil, and we achieved 2 documents in the end of the meeting. One is the principal document, and the other one was the way forward. And these 2 documents, I suppose, in some way signal the way to go in the right direction from the internet. We heard in the opening in this session, Cathy saying that we have to struggle for have a framework, because it's difficult to have really a very coherent jurisdiction. I think it's an impossible goal, but maybe we have to work toward frameworks. And I also remember Bertrand's phrase that we recognize the environment is very complex, but we have not to complicate them more. It's different to be complex and to be complicated. It's a very important point. Then I think we have to strive to preserve the multi-stakeholder and the achievement we have done right now. We did some good steps on that, and we have to strive to keep the core of the internet open and public as always. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Mokhtar Yedali, who heads the Information Society Division of the African Union Commission. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you, all of you, for this opportunity given to the African Union Commission. And I actually wonder why I wouldn't be in Paris. We should have been in Paris to start this, because as I was saying at the beginning, the aspiration of the African Union and the African continent is the unity and therefore the harmonization of our policy and regulations, and hence the issue of jurisdictions is very important. We have 54 states, diverse, including Wakanda Nation. If you know Wakanda Nation, right? Wakanda forever. Anyway, well, you see that the issue of harmonization of our policy and then the coherence is very, very challenging. It is actually a research field that is actually untapped for the time being. So the aspirations and the concept of the unity of the African continent was conceived outside of the digital world, and therefore today we need to make sure that we are factoring all we have said. The issue of movement, free movement of people and goods, and hence the flow of data is actually something that it will be very much important. So therefore we have learned a lot. And from now to Berlin, we'll be making sure that we will be factoring all those issues related to domain names, related to the data flow, and related specifically to the content development, because Africa, as you may see, is the net consumer of content. If we exclude Nigeria and Egypt, you will see that probably there is no content really produced in Africa. And even to the point that some people are getting really radicalized on this matter by talking about something that we will not want to hear, which is the digital colonization or recolonization of the continent by a flow of content and data and so on. So it is very then important for us to make sure that we are factoring the continent, making a place for the continent. In 2014, when the first movie or the superhero comes in and we see the first time a Black Panther coming into the things, I said, oh, Africa is now into the governance, internet governance issues. So which is actually very good. Africa is coming in, and we need to make sure that we are working with you, collaborating. And this was an opportunity for me to speak to OSC. Harlem this year is I'm very proud to be planning something with you. Vincerf and other people I have spoken to. We will make sure that we'll be doing something before Berlin, and specifically with you guys, the Secretariat. We'll make sure that we'll be doing something before that, something tangible and concrete. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I don't like 3 minutes. Make me run and repeat. But again, I have just a question. I have 8 seconds. You have created this arena. Will be somebody dancing here?
No, they actually were in Canada. There should be a campfire, but we couldn't do it inside.
And it's too warm outside. With this, I would like to give the floor to Rod over there, who raised his hand before. Could we have a microphone for him, please?
Hi, thank you. I was in the domains track yesterday, and I'd like to thank Martin for doing a great job leading us through that and putting up with me and a few other people in the room. Since it's Chatham House, we won't say who, we're talking a lot. But I think we had an excellent conversation yesterday, and I had a couple of takeaways and a couple of recommendations. And I know that's 4 instead of 3, but I'm sorry, Bertrand. So the couple of takeaways were that in this room, a lot of the people there, we've been in many other rooms talking about similar issues, but there were a lot of new people as well. I was struck by the way we were able to talk about an issue, talk about the issues within the issue, unpack that, but actually listen to each other in that, and actually evolve the positions, and people were able to understand better the perspectives others had, and that does not always happen, as we know, in these places. So there was a very good environment for that, and I think we made some good progress. As we were unpacking issues, we found things to be a little more complex than they appeared on the surface. And there was one personal quote that was quoted in the room, which was Einstein, and which was his quote was to something along the lines of "make things as simple as possible, but not simpler." And I think that's a good mantra for us all to have here. And I'm not the one who brought it up. Somebody else very famous brought that up in the room. But I think we actually used that in the spirit of the discussions in the room. So that was good. A couple of thoughts I had on going forward. I'm going to put on a hat. Oh, I didn't identify myself, Rod Rasmussen, in my personal capacity, but I'm going to put on my new hat that I just picked up recently. As many of you know, I'm now the chair of the Security and Stability Advisory Committee at ICANN, ESSAC. And as I also was thinking about this, we bring together in that organization disparate views and people with different backgrounds around the security space. We get together, we discuss the issues, we do, actually assign tasks out, we do what we call work parties, but then we bring that back to the whole organization and then review that and then put out publications. In those publications, we say this kind of work should be done. Here's some people we think should do that kind of work, and here's some things we need to be looking at. I find that a striking parallel potentially to what we're doing here. I'm not saying copy everything we do, because we're crazy people, often we're doing weird stuff. But anyways, there's that. The last observation or recommendation I wanted to make is that there's a lot of people here who are senior and have done a lot of great work in this space. There's not a lot of people here who actually write orders or write requests and then build software or build systems to actually handle those requests. So it would be great to see more of them in this forum, but also included other forums. I would encourage people here who have those kinds of people who know what's going on to actually bring those people into the discussion, the ones that put hands on keyboards and actually do things. We have some here, not saying there's not, but I think we could really use the perspectives of the people who have to deal with it on a daily basis. Apologies for going over slightly.
Thank you very much for those comments, and I must say I'm fascinated by the number of citations of philosophers in a policy conference. But I think then again, what we are faced with, or the challenges that we are trying to address, are precisely about what is the digital society that we want. So I think actually it is very appropriate. The next one who would like to speak is over there. Could we have a microphone for Lee, please? Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. Lee Tuthill with the World Trade Organization. I think I can say that one of my takeaways is, as I would agree, that the problems are very complex, but it appears that when you get a group of experts in the room, and not just experts in one facet, but because it's multi-stakeholder, you get experts who have different perspectives. The way forward and some of the solutions probably seem less complex than, or less daunting than you might have thought. And I know our colleague from Mexico referred to the fact that trade negotiators have been thinking about many of the things discussed in the work tracks that took place over the last couple of days, especially I think in the last decade since 2007, when one of the first e-commerce chapters of a regional bilateral trade agreement really had much more substance in what they were calling e-commerce at the time. And so it's very, very much on the minds of trade negotiators in a sense that they don't have at their disposal the kind of expertise that has been in this room, and I get a sense, are very intimidated by these issues. At the same time, when I listened into two different groups, the data and the content, and I see very much the kinds of principles that are trade principles that are perhaps inadvertently being taken into account, the kind of transparency, the procedural aspects, that trying to make procedures more efficient and less burdensome on the people who have to abide by the rules that are being set out. And finally, this sense that I think is very important, that has come up again and again and is in trade agreements as well, proportionality and necessity in the trade sense, so that you avoid a more damaging effect on trade than you need to have for some of these things. So I see a commonality. I think that going forward, I can contribute a bit of the aspects that how there is a bit of an intersection or a plug-in with some of the trade principles that is already, from what I can see, very complementary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, could we have a microphone over there, please? Adiel. Thank you.
Thank you. Adiel Aplogan, Vice President Technical Engagement at ICANN, but speaking in my own capacity. I just want to say, first of all, that this is amazing. I would like to thank the Secretariat because the energy it takes to bring people around this topic is massive. And my first takeaway is that it's very encouraging to see so much people start working on this topic, which is a real topic for the internet. The jurisdiction, and especially the cross-border jurisdiction, is going to be an issue that will grow, will take different form going forward. And seeing the engagement, the enthusiasm of people I've met here, this is my first meeting, give me hope that we are seeing it and we are engaged to work towards some solution. I was in the domain session yesterday. There have been bright idea, a lot of positive thing coming up, and from the other group as well. Two idea, interest me. One is about building tools. We talk about glossary and so on. I think it's very important for people who are not in this room to also understand some aspect of the complexities, have a referral to where they can find the information, how they can deal with those complexity while dealing with their day-to-day work. The second aspect as well is the capacity building or capability building, both work, meaning giving people who are involved in this field all the tools that they need to solve or address those issues. I'm sure that with all the resources in this room, we are going to achieve those things. But one aspect that I think need attention as well is how do we promote the result of those things? How do we make sure that people around the world, because the internet is used by everyone nowadays, or is going to be used by everyone. How do we make sure that the outcome of our work, the framework we build, the tools that we build, are well promoted, that people use them? Because only then we can be able to have effective results. So those are my takeaway and some of the suggestions I have. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think the last point that you raised is particularly important, how to ensure the outreach, that the results of this amazing work are shared, that it's more inclusive, that more people learn about this. And here I can just reiterate what we have already said before. We rely on you here in this room, especially the ones that manage large processes, that manage already existing networks, to have a network impact and a network effect, basically. This is really important, and we encourage you, either here in the plenary or after the conference, via email or a phone call, to reach out to us with opportunities and suggestions of how can this be done in the best possible manner. And we have time before the break to take one additional comment from the floor, and then we have a coffee break. Would someone, it's always a difficult situation to stand between a full plenary room and the coffee break, I know, but no. With this, we break for 30 minutes, and we start again at 11:30. Thank you very much. Thank you. With this, we're coming to the second part of this stakeholder plenary session on the roadmap until Berlin. I would like to start this session with Manal Ismail. She's the Executive Director of the International Technical Coordination at the National Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of Egypt, and she's the Chair of the Government Advisory Committee of ICANN. You have the floor.
Thank you, and allow me to start by thanking Bertrand, Paul, and the whole Secretariat for their hard work in coordinating efforts on such an important topic, and to thank each and everyone who has supported and contributing to the founding of this initiative. I haven't been part of previous efforts, but I truly appreciate the progress that has been made, and I have found the discussions very substantial and very interesting and informative. I have to admit that as a newcomer, I have been peeking to different rooms and have settled at the end in the domain names one. And also to praise this innovative setup of the room. I would also like to start by stressing the importance of this topic, Internet and jurisdiction, to governments as a stakeholder concerned with global policies that may interact or intersect with national laws and public policy objectives. And also as they try to grow the digital economy while addressing their competing demands and challenging obligations. As we move forward, it is important to continue the constructive dialogue, maintain the cooperative spirit, reach out and keep the process multi-stakeholder, inclusive of all stakeholders and in coordination with the relevant global efforts and initiatives. It is also important to promote and disseminate the outcomes of this process at the national level. So it's all about hitting the right balances, how to satisfy law enforcement requirements and satisfy human rights requirements, how to ensure safety and security of and on the internet while maintaining its openness and nature as a platform for innovation, how to respect national laws and follow global standards. So it's important to recognize the delicacy of what will come up from this process in order not to give away the benefits of the internet. A burdening process would kill the open and innovative nature of the internet, and the lack of a process would lead to mistrust, both of which may have long-lasting effects, particularly on unconnected citizens in developing countries. So intersessionally, in order to structure our work, achieve the agreed objectives, and come up with concrete implementable solutions, we need to have a roadmap or a work plan that includes a timeline, milestones, expected deliverables, as well as how to measure our progress throughout the process. Moreover, as a picture is worth 1,000 words, along with the excellent, concise briefs, I believe blueprints for solutions should include infographics illustrating possible scenarios, proposed processes, and data flow diagrams. Furthermore, despite being distinct, and as mentioned earlier by other speakers, despite that the three work tracks are distinct, overlap occurs, so at some point in time, coordinating and aligning outputs need to be taken into consideration. Also, developments and progress of relevant initiatives should guide our work to avoid repeating the same discussions. And it's good to hear what happened in the data track as well. Furthermore, focus should not only be on urgent matters, but also be forward-looking, keeping in mind non-pressing but potential jurisdiction challenges, such as those that may be imposed by the wide deployment of Internet of Things, for example. Finally, I would say the target should be having standardized interfaces and interoperable procedures for global standards that respect local differences and local rules that appreciate global standards. Thank you. And apologies for significantly going beyond the 3 minutes. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Manal. Now I would like to give the floor to Lise Voor. She's the Director General of the European Telecommunications Network Operators Association, or in short, ETNO. And a particular thank you because you've come straight from Barcelona just to be here with us on this day. You have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us to speak. Yes, I'm actually a newcomer to this conference. ETNO has been in Paris, but personally, this is my first one. And I actually think it really, this conference shows us how many challenges there is in making the internet accessible, inclusive, secure, and trustworthy. And I think these are three or some very important issues for all of us, and we all are responsible for making this happen. I think all of the three work streams are interrelated, as Bertrand mentioned before. And I see a lot of commonalities, like we have the ask for a common language, a glossary. We also have the proportionality issues. We need transparency. And also the training and education of how to deal with these issues are key in all three work streams. If I am to look at the way to Berlin, I think any solution that we're going to come up with needs to be future-oriented, and it also needs to be technology-neutral. Here, Vint Cerf mentioned briefly on that internet is not all. There are many other layers that we should be aware of. And I agree with this. Also, we should respect the increasing convergence of the different industries. And here, being a telco, we move into other parts of businesses, and we see the internet players do the same. And we need to take an approach that is not sector-specific, but more a wider approach. Furthermore, of course, we believe a solution should be very balanced, and any due process needs to ensure that the liability is sorted out here. So we need to ensure that no end-user right is being violated in the process, but also that the private companies don't get caught up to be liable because they're accommodating a request. Furthermore, any framework should not be over burdensome. Here, I'm especially worried for the small businesses. And I see my time is running out, so I have to be quick here. I think one last thing I'd like to touch upon is actually also mentioned by Chris Despain. We need to ensure that, of course, all governments are included in these processes, but also the different enforcement organizations. And here, the international ones, like Interpol, is quite obvious. So from our side, we would like to see a broader variety of stakeholders. Even though we have a lot of people here, we need to ensure that the law enforcement is also included. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Next, I would like to give the floor to Daphne Keller, who's the Director for Intermediary Liability at the Center for Internet Society at Stanford Law School. You have the floor.
Thank you, Paul. So I won't repeat the thanks to Paul and Bertrand because they know what they have accomplished here. But I do want to thank the many, many people who have been having intense conversations for 3 days in their second language or their third language. We would not be interoperable without you. So thank you to all of you. I want to echo Lisa's points about the connections between the three work streams. As I noted at the end of the Paris discussion, they're at very different stages of maturity. The data work stream has direct engagement of governments. It has proposed laws. It has litigation not just teed up. It has litigation before the US Supreme Court. The content work stream is at sort of a more middling stage of maturity, and the domains work stream, I think, raises issues that are wildly under-recognized by people outside of this room. I think it is incumbent upon us to notice the ways that resolutions from the more mature work streams could impact the others. It may be that Peter will develop the best possible recommendations for the data work stream, and then those may be uncritically applied to questions about content and expression or domain name management, and that would be a dangerous mistake. Let me identify a couple of ways that the questions are different. One is about the rights affected. When law enforcement seeks access to data about an individual, that typically implicates the privacy and due process rights of that person or of a finite set of people. When a government or a claimant asks a platform to take down a piece of information, that implicates the rights potentially of everyone in the world. If you think about the Panama Papers as an example, the key right there is not the speech right of the journalist. The key right is the access to information rights of people around the world. And so rules that make sense and may be adequate to protect rights in the surveillance context will not be adequate in the content context. Another distinction is that the content context permits tailored remedies. You can have geographically limited enforcement, you can have temporally limited enforcement, whereas for law enforcement requests to user data, the outcomes are binary. You hand over the data or you do not hand over the data. And then finally, as Matthew Prince pointed out on the first day, there are very important players in this space who do not fit neatly within any of the tracks, and yet their decisions profoundly affect the internet and all of our rights. The other thing that I would say is thank you to the many governments who have representatives here. And for those of you who have been thinking about this and have working groups, please tell your friends. I think this process can only succeed with more government involvement, and in particular with the involvement both of government players who are interested in enforcement, protecting the rights of their citizens, potentially through global enforcement, but also government entities who are on the receiving end of that, who are concerned about other governments enforcing rules that might affect their citizens' rights. And so it's wonderful to see the increasing number of government spokespeople who show up, and I hope that in Berlin we will see even more. Thank you so much. Okay, I will thank you guys. Thank you so much to Bertrand and Paul for making this happen.
Thank you very much. And I think the last point about government engagement, I just want to add a point that was already raised on the first day of the conference. It is important to also acknowledge the diversity of views within government. So it is important to engage the different ministries because they have different interests or different objectives in those discussions. And this process is also about reconciling those sometimes conflicting or competing objectives. And it is also the same as we acknowledged on the first day of the conference, even for large companies where different departments might have different views on different topics. And the guy who's in charge of the cables has different positions than policy or marketing people. With this, I would like to give the floor to Guy Berger. He's the Director of Freedom of Expression and Media Development of UNESCO. And I also want to thank UNESCO for the institutional support for the second Global Internet and Jurisdiction Conference. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Bertrand. I think it will be no surprise for people to hear that as UNESCO I attended the content stream. It was mentioned earlier today that UNESCO has also been working with judges on international standards for freedom of expression and their limitations. And in fact, UNESCO has trained more than 8,000 people in the judiciaries in Africa and in Latin America and in the Middle East. And what we've noticed is that there's a huge hunger amongst judges there about how to apply standards of freedom of expression to online issues, which of course often implicate cross-border dimensions. I think you may also know, though, that UNESCO has, besides this work with judges, developed a heuristic, which are the Rome principles. So I have to test you to see how effective we have been in promoting ROAM. What is R? Rights. O, openness. A, accessibility. M, multi-stakeholder. Thank you. So these are the principles that UNESCO has developed. through a big consultation as to how we think the internet could best function. Now, online content is implicated in each of these, so of course it's shaped by the rights and when rights can be legitimately, though exceptionally limited. Online content also has dimensions related to openness, such as fair use. It's also key to accessibility, such as local content and media and information literacy. And multi-stakeholder engagement can clearly enrich both state and private sector policies for stimulating, using, or curbing online content. So these are fairly obvious planks, the ROAM, that I think everyone can agree on for the internet. But I invite you to play around a little bit because it's more than just platitudes. This model, I think, can give us some interesting insights. So in the rights realm, of course, we know in human rights there's always a need to balance rights. So the right of an individual to produce and receive content sometimes has to be balanced against another person's rights to reputation or security. And we know that in these cases we should use the least intrusive solution, legality, necessity, proportionality, legitimate purpose. And in principle, we know this balancing should be domestically and in terms of cross-jurisdictional cases. But what this Rome model actually tells us further is that this kind of deciding when there are limitations on rights, whether this decision-making is in the drafting of law, the drafting of regulation, or in court decisions, or even in terms of services, that this kind of decision on limitations of rights needs to take into account the particular circumstances where contested content is online. In other words, within the environment of the internet. So this Rome framework tells us that if we're assessing online content within the rights realm, we also have to consider it in relation to the other key dimensions of the internet as regards the relevance to openness, accessibility, and multi-stakeholderism. So in other words, Rome suggests that any limits on freedom of expression also need to resonate with our shared interests in upholding the internet's essential alignment with openness, accessibility, and multi-stakeholder. Now, what we've done at UNESCO to try and take this model forward and give it a bit more teeth is to develop these indicators, which we're doing in partnership with APC. And the idea of having indicators to assess compliance or alignment of rights, openness, accessibility, multi-stakeholder, this is to produce evidence-based policy recommendations, which would impact on policies and practices as regards online content, and indeed cross-jurisdictional online content. So when these indicators are baked and done, which will be later this year, they will become a UNESCO-endorsed instrument based on international standards. And any set of actors can then assess the national situation in regard to domestic content limitation. Now, clearly, these indicators are coming from the point of view of application in a nation state. And of course, however, they implicate the extent to which a state can exercise jurisdiction. So you can call these principles Rome at home. But we know that, of course, you can never actually efface the specter of jurisdictional issues from here. However, by promoting some alignment to international standards in a large number of countries, these indicators contribute to reducing the number of contestations around content between jurisdictions. And where contestations continue, which of course they will, the question then is whether the Rome principles themselves can roam. In other words, whether they can be useful for the design of the operational interfaces between jurisdictions when the issue concerns online content. So in wrapping up, I ask you to please give your comments so that we can then develop these indicators in a way that will synergize their value with this process over here. So all roads and all their travelers can help us reach Rome, R-O-M-E, and the frame and the indicators can be shaped to reinforce the raison d'etre of this IJP and give some perspective towards the Berlin milestone. 2 weeks' time closure for commenting on the draft indicators. So if you want to help shape them and make these indicators useful to this particular project, please look up Rome Indicators, UNESCO, and put your comments in the next 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. And thank you for the different comments. I want to ask, as we said before, any other comments or things that you want to share regarding one takeout or one takeaway from the event. One thing that struck you, one thing that you were surprised of. If everything was according to what you expected and everything has gone as planned, it's also a success. I'm fine with it. But any particular thing that you want to share, Martin?
Thank you very much. Well, what struck me already on day one is, Bertrand, you've come a long way. And I'm deeply impressed by the commitment and the number of stakeholders you've been able to collect around this little cross in the middle here. Really excellent. It shows that we have now also, I think, the critical mass and the width to move forward effectively and authoritatively. I felt that same feeling during the meeting, where there was such a good mix of both stakeholders and expertise that really gives some depth to the material that we're developing. So I think go on with what you're doing, and we'll help you. As you rightly said, you can't do it alone, but we're with you. And I feel we're very well on our way to make the best possible difference in what is complex matter.
Thank you, Martin. When you actually started, I thought you were going to compliment me for becoming a little bit more concise, but it's all plus.
Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice, and knowing you, Bertrand, I should not have been surprised, but nonetheless I was at the new standard you've set for the preparation of a conference like this. Not just the material that was distributed, but the highly specific set of guiding questions and documents to read. The logistics, including the format of the rooms and the setup that you've done, is by far the best organized and most, actually the most helpful to facilitating the kind of interaction you wanted to have happen while we were here. So I thank you for that and recognize that that's going to be a standard for others who will be difficult to reach.
Well. Thank you for this, but I want to say that both the quality of the input document owes a lot, honestly, to the exchanges that took place during the calls, and for those of you who have participated in this, we hope to keep the same spirit afterwards. And as far as the logistics are concerned, well, there is a lot also that is to be credited to the two other members of the team that you see less, but that you've discovered here. There's Martin and Xavier. I don't know if they're in the room. If they can stand, Martin here and Xavier here. And also, again, a big thank you to the people here in Canada from the ministries and from CIRA that have greatly helped us. And I don't know if Julie from CIRA is in the room. If she's not, I'd be happy that she can come later so that we can recognize the great work that she's done. With that, Paul, do you want to transition?
Yes, absolutely. So as we all know, yesterday was an intense and very productive way, and you have all worked very hard. We felt the energy yesterday, and we feel that now you have basically the sense of not only having accomplished something, but it was really a hard day. It was a lot of work. And I think that the work plans that come out, and they will be distributed when we leave this room, and the way forward that you envisage together is really a testimony to what many of you have already mentioned, which is this collaborative spirit in the policy network. And I think this is something very special. And this has animated everybody here in Ottawa. And we as the Secretariat, we hope that this outcome of this conference will not only provide a path forward as a community mandate, but also hopefully help to synchronize international discussions and contribute to enhancing policy coherence, as we discussed on the very first day of this conference. As you know, we as the Secretariat, we have made a conscious decision not to be in the work streams yesterday, because it was very important for us that the community owns those work plans. This is what you collectively want to do together. And this is very important. We will now take the time and evaluate all the notes and evaluate the work plans, and also evaluate this in conjunction with what hopefully comes out of the supporters meeting this afternoon, the available resources, because cooperation requires resources, and propose the best possible way forward based on your work. And I just want to take one step back and just share something, because I think we've come really quite far at this conference. When the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network was launched, the first challenge was to make sure that we can collectively find a problem framing where governments, companies, civil society actors, academia, technical operators, and international organizations can basically describe the problem with the same vernacular. This was quite a challenge 7 years ago. And I think this was a first major breakthrough of this policy network, to be able to frame the problems in a way that is making problems that the different actors, even in this room, have with each other, to transform this into a problem or challenges that we all face together. And this creates the spirit in this policy network, I believe. The next step was the success of the first global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network in Paris. Here, for the first time, actors gathered and said, not only there is a problem, but we need to do something, and the solutions will not be found through unilateral actions, but through cooperation. This is where you collectively decided on areas of cooperation to focus on. And now, with the policy options coming out of the intersessional work that was tabled for this conference, you have accomplished for the first time all together to develop concrete work plans that would structure the work ahead. And I think this is really a breakthrough. The roadmap until the next Global Internet and Jurisdiction Conference in Berlin is 15 months. 15 months to achieve tangible progress, to work on operational solutions, on policy standards. 15 months to enhance policy coherence. 15 months to advance from this uncoordinated reaction to really coordinated action in the policy network. And I think we should all capitalize on this momentum that was created here in Ottawa throughout those 3 days. We now know what the next steps are to build the necessary frameworks and standards for the digital society that we want. And we are looking forward to this next chapter, or to this next phase of this journey. And I want to reiterate again, we as the Secretariat of the Policy Network, we're at your disposal. We're there to serve the stakeholders, to help you do what you decided you want to do together. We're here to enable the cooperation between the different stakeholders. And I want to sincerely thank everybody in this room, the participants of the second global conference of this policy network, again for the hard dedication and the commitment to develop solutions to some of the most complex governance challenges of our time.
If I may actually intersect one thing here that I forgot to say before we go to the final concluding remarks. I wanted to pick 2 or 3 things that were said in the last interventions. I think the expression spillover effect is a very important concept that emerged, at least for me, in this environment. I would say almost with irony that after having worked so hard to eliminate silos between constituencies, we suddenly realized that by doing it by issue, we're creating silos between issues. So it's an endless game, and this realization of the interconnection between the 3 tracks is a very important thing. And what was said before, I think, by Peter and Daphne, the fact that the solutions and the principles that might be adopted in separate processes on data may have spillover effects on other things, and this is another issue of policy coherence that we had not identified particularly. We completely hear the question about the participation of law enforcement. Do not take the exact distribution of stakeholders in the physical conference as a reflection of the structure of the whole network. There were constraints for some participants, and particularly from law enforcement, due to other processes, to be in the meeting here. But law enforcement, be it Interpol, Europol, or other national law enforcement, is fully participating, and this is an important element that I wanted to highlight. And finally, I think Daphne was mentioning the different dynamics in the tracks. It is true that the data stream at the moment, or the topic of e-evidence, is getting a lot of attention because of the events that are on the international scene, new proposals for laws, etc. But I would highlight that in the content space, there are also signals of the same sort. This includes very important court decisions. Those of you who are here are probably familiar with the Equistec case that took place in Canada. There are others coming from Canada, but there's also an ongoing series of court cases in the European Court of Justice on the right to be de-indexed as well, and the interpretation of the geographic scope. There are national laws that are being implemented, and some of them have been discussed. So the content track will also see very concrete element, putting it on the international agenda. And finally, even the domain, as I was mentioning yesterday, some of the decisions that are being envisaged, including in the European Union approach for access to e-evidence, pay attention to the role of domain operators. So I just wanted to highlight those few points because this is enriching the concept of policy coherence that we have discussed as a first element of this conference, and I would have been remiss not to spot it. Thank you.
Well, with this, we now reach the final part of the conference, and I am delighted to open the closing session of the second Global Conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. And I would like to give the floor to Alan Kessel, who's the Assistant Deputy Minister for Legal Affairs and Legal Advisor at the Department of Global Affairs of Canada, with a special thank you again for Canada of being our partner for the second Global Conference.
Well, un grand merci à vous tous d'être venus ici à Ottawa, spécialement dans le mois de février, mais il fait soleil aujourd'hui à l'extérieur. Thank you for all of you coming here to Ottawa, especially in February. You brought the sunshine with you. I'm very pleased you did. Those of you who left minus 10 or 12 in Europe, apparently they're frolicking in Rome. Un grand merci à vous, Bertrand, aussi, et vielen Dank à Paul. I spent about 34 years in international diplomacy, amongst other things, and it's always refreshing to learn new things. In fact, there was a moment when I thought I should start a support group for some of us in the room. I was going to call it LudditesRUs.com, just for those who had not experienced what depth of incredible knowledge and intellect is around. I do feel after 3 days being here that I will give up my honorary membership on the Jurassic Park Board of Directors, because I do think I've learned more than I expected to. Our discussions here this week have demonstrated that our collective challenges involve fundamental questions that we must address together and urgently. How do we develop appropriate governance mechanisms for our global digital society? How do we understand sovereignty in the digital age? And how do we ensure that international law and the international rule of law extends to all actors on the internet? And how do we define the respective roles of public and private actors in order to ensure a free and open internet in a rules-based cyberspace? The stakes are very high. Global and national security and stability, human rights, sovereignty, the free exchange of ideas, and access to information for all of the world's citizens. The Government of Canada is glad to have supported this event financially and in various other ways. Many of my colleagues from departments are with us in this room today. We recognize that such productive discussions don't just represent 3 days of work, but rather years of sustained efforts by I&J and the key stakeholders all of you who have engaged in the dialogue and embraced the methodology so ably facilitated by the Internet and Jurisdiction team. Indeed, the Government of Canada has been engaged and committed in the INJ's work for several years, and we intend to stay engaged. The road does not end in Ottawa. Our fruitful discussions here in Ottawa this week have built on what was done at the first global conference in 2016. I'd like to recognize, je voudrais reconnaître le rôle de la France, spécialement dans ce domaine. Just recognize the leadership of France in the first conference and their continued and active engagement. And I will reiterate some of the comments that were made earlier today, is that more states need to be involved as we get to some very pointy bits in our discussion on the way to Berlin. We've made a lot of progress this week. I'm encouraged that we depart having agreed on significant and concrete objectives and how to structure the questions for each of the 3 work streams. In effect, we have agreed on a roadmap from Ottawa to Berlin. There's a lot to do, but now we know where we are and what path we're on. I'd also like to take this moment to thank Germany for stepping forward to help lead us from the plans agreed here in Ottawa and to the next phase, bis nach Berlin. I have mentioned the French and German governments, but I want to underline that all of you present here today have indispensable roles in addressing the challenges of the Internet and jurisdiction. Thank you for your efforts and your commitment. Canada remains convinced that the multi-stakeholder approach is an optimal approach to deal and address these complex matters. It's in the best traditions of the Internet. I want to underline a theme that has been recurring throughout the week, and namely the need for coherence and coordination in the multiple efforts and initiatives that seek to respond to the Internet and jurisdiction issues. Canada sees the work piloted by the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, as INJ, as unique and essential. We also see it as complementary to and coherent with other developments in the cyber field that we are engaged in, along with many of you, namely the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime, the Budapest Convention, and the negotiations currently underway on the new protocol and efforts to have more states join us in the convention, the UN Group of Government Experts, GGE process, the developments in UN circles, notably in Vienna, the Freedom Online Coalition with German leadership, and importantly, the G7, during Canada's presidency in 2018 and onward to France's presidency, which follows us starting in January 2019. And for Canada, all of these are important and valuable. Because of this, it is essential that the developments in each of these are coherent in order to help strengthen the international rule of law and a rules-based international order in general and ensure its application in cyberspace. Here again, the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network plays an invaluable role in helping key stakeholders come together and generate ideas and plans that help take all of these developments into account. As head of the Canadian Foreign Ministry's legal department, I was encouraged to see the considerable attention given to international law and the rule of law during the discussions this week. Just to mention the very prickly issues of sovereignty and extraterritoriality. Many of the lawyers in the room will remember that these things have been around for a long time and are not going to disappear very quickly. In closing, on behalf of the Government of Canada, I want to thank all of you for coming to Ottawa and for engaging so constructively in discussions this week. I'm convinced that our continued work together under the continued forward-looking guidance of INJ will bear fruit and will help us craft solutions that will ensure that the Internet and jurisdiction issues are addressed. We must proceed with renewed focus and speed, but not haste, on the road to Berlin. We need to aim high, but we need not expect perfection. What is key is coherence grounded in the rule of law. we can and we must, in the best spirit of the internet, stumble forward. As the Canadian-based African philosopher Machona Diluau aptly put it, since you kept on bringing up philosophers, stumbling towards greatness is better than sprinting towards mediocrity. Merci beaucoup, and see you in Berlin.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those remarks. Now I would like to give the floor to David Reddle, who came to us also from the Mobile World Congress from Barcelona overnight just to be here with us today. He's the Assistant Secretary for Communications and Information and the Administrator of the NTIA of the Department of Commerce of the United States of America. You have the floor.
Well, thank you. It's great to be in Ottawa. It was quite the overnight travel, but we made it here, and I want to thank you and Bertrand and the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network for organizing the conference and for inviting me to speak. On a personal note, I've been in this role as NTIA Administrator for about 3 months, but prior to that, I spent the last 7 years working for the U.S. House of Representatives, and it's a pleasure to get to continue to work with so many of the folks in the room who I had the chance to work with in that role, in this new role. So thank you to all of you. We're here because the internet has fundamentally upended our prior understanding of national jurisdiction. Everyone here knows it, but it's worth repeating nonetheless. Today, data is moving around the globe in previously unimaginable quantities, crossing borders without recognition of national boundary. Data that is created in one country is often sent to, stored in, and processed in multiple additional countries. In many jurisdictions, this is occurring against the backdrop of dated legal frameworks that are not equipped to respond to advances in technology. I should say up front that the free flow of data is a development worth celebrating. It's been a driver of economic growth, it's led to widespread educational opportunities, and it's given a voice to people who have previously been relegated to silence. But as I've become keenly aware in my new role as administrator of NTIA, it's led to a variety of complex challenges for governments around the world who must address the issues of privacy, security, and logistics that come with the rapid growth and globalization of data. Governments around the world are finding that the old ways of ensuring national security, conducting law enforcement operations, and protecting the privacy rights of their citizens are being challenged by a medium that does not conform to borders or existing legal regimes. Indeed, the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network's 3 work streams hit at the heart of these challenges. In data and jurisdiction, for instance, we see how prior methods of obtaining evidence for criminal investigations and prosecutions are being undercut by rapid changes in technology. As a result of the growth of cloud computing and new and sophisticated data storage methods, long-standing legal and policy regimes designed in an analog world where information was almost exclusively stored locally are today being made obsolete. In content and jurisdiction, similarly, we're witnessing how the mass proliferation of digital content made available on a global scale by the internet is leading to legal, cultural, and in certain respects, ideological conflicts. These conflicts are putting immense pressure not only on governments who must uphold their domestic laws, but also on the platforms hosting the content, as they're forced to reconcile regularly competing legal demands of multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. And in the domains and jurisdiction discussion, lastly, we're seeing how the underlying infrastructure of the internet is being tested by abuses of and on the domain name system and the inherent ambiguity of what is an appropriate response to potentially abusive behavior. These 3 work streams represent some of the most challenging legal and policy questions of the digital age. The question is how we respond as governments, as industry, as civil society, and as a global community to these challenges. In some countries, governments are responding with restrictive and isolationist policies. These include censorship, blocking, demanding a right to be forgotten, and requiring localized data storage. These policies seek to maintain the perception that our borderless open internet can be managed, bounded, and conformed to fit with local laws. These actions are understandable, but regrettable. We understand that governments are trying to respond to very real challenges and concerns that their citizens have. They want to both protect and project their sovereignty. But global companies end up getting caught in the middle of these conflicting policies. And as they work to address competing and inconsistent legal demands, the inevitable result is that users suffer diminished access and benefits from the network. I'm optimistic that governments will ultimately realize that it's in everyone's interest to keep the internet open and keep the data flowing around the world. The key will be whether civil society, industry, and forward-looking voices in government are able to effectively highlight the benefits of a global internet to persuade those on the other side of the debate that the challenges of the free flow of data are far outweighed by the benefits. That's why the work of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network is so important. Being here is my first exposure to this initiative, but it's already clear that INJ has few peers in terms of bringing together the kinds of diverse stakeholders needed to examine the range of jurisdictional challenges facing the Internet today. From questions of law enforcement access to data to debates over the roles of intermediaries, the INJ is helping the international community develop a common framework for understanding the problem and moving forward towards solutions. I join my colleague from Canada in thanking Germany for its decision to host INJ in 2018. And I look forward to continuing the productive relationship between NTIA and the INJ as we move forward to that conference. I'd also like to echo Paul's sentiments about the work that can be done between now and Berlin. I hope that the intersessional work will continue, and we'll focus on producing deliverable solutions that can be approved in Berlin. I'm pleased to hear the Secretariat stands ready to support those efforts, and I know that the experts in this room and those that have participated that are not here in the work streams are up to the task. Thanks for your time, and more importantly, thank you to all of you for your hard work on these extraordinarily complex issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those remarks, David. Now I would like to give the floor to Catalina Botero. She is the Dean of the University of Los Andes in Colombia, and she is the former Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the Organization of American States. You have the floor.
Thank you, Paul.
It works.
It's working. I would like to begin by thanking Bertrand and Paul for having this and for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak at this closing session. 4 years ago, when I was the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights at the Organization of American States, we released a relatively comprehensive report outlining the standards we considered essential to maintaining an open, safe, free, and global Internet. When I finished my job, and I returned to my native Colombia, the country was in the middle of a peace process designed to end a 50-year of a violent internal conflict. Finally, in 2016, the peace agreement was signed. One point of the peace agreement refers to the right of the victims to not be re-victimized, but also the peace agreement recognizes the right to the truth, the right to the historical memory of the atrocious crimes committed for half a century, which left more than 7 million victims. At that point, I realized how important the Inter-American Internet principles were in defending the rights of those victims of the conflict. But at the same time, I understood that such principles were clearly insufficient for at least 2 reasons. In the first place, given their degree of generality, they had to be turned into concrete policies to make them efficient and enforceable. And secondly, because the principles exclusively dealt with members of the Organization of American States, they lack a global scope. Without a global scope, the voices of Colombian victims cannot be heard by judges who in other latitudes decide what content can be circulated on the internet. But in the context of the information society, these decisions may contribute to erasing the historic memory or to re-victimizing a child recruited by the rebels or one of the thousands of women who were sexually assaulted. Without the global and fair standards, the victims will not be heard by the data protection agencies, which define to what extent the protection of personal data may imply the de-indexing of information. But this information can be indispensable for the collective memory and the right to truth. The victims of grave violations of human rights in Colombia are not part of such judicial processes. And the reality is not on the cultural horizon of the Canadian or European or Asian or African judges, regulators, or private companies making decisions. In the face of the challenges set out by the extraterritoriality of legal or judicial decisions, the rights of the victims to not be re-victimized, as well as the right to truth, and memory will depend on the existence of stakeholders' forums in which coherent, consistent, adequate, transparent, and democratic principles and policies could be adopted. In this sense, this forum is unique. There is no other conference on these issues where experts from all over the world, from different disciplines and very different cultural and political backgrounds, participate. This is precisely the singular importance of this conference. It is therefore an extraordinary scenario to jointly find principles and concrete policies to offer to the judges, agencies, and the private sector. Needless to say that many of the judges who have to define these topics studied law when we didn't even have access to a personal email account. Most of them cannot fully comprehend the complexity of the cases they have to solve. Many of the data protection agencies base themselves on the absolute precedence of habeas data, and they do not evaluate the impact that a single decision can have on the whole internet architecture. Many of the regulators of private companies adopted measures that can turn into global measures without understanding the differentiating impact on the different culture and political contexts. However, those decisions can affect the rights of more than 3.7 billion users of the internet. This conference, all of us together can help to offer criteria so that the measures adopted can avoid abuse, protect human rights, and develop the digital economy in order to reduce poverty and inequality. But we have to do this now. We are at a turning point. I am afraid that if we do not undertake the task of developing standards, concrete policies, and even operational solutions, other people will do this for us. But these other people may not be concerned about strengthening democracy. The goal we have to reach now before shared values are irreversibly affected is that of working together during the next 15 months, taking into account what we have achieved in this second conference to propose concrete principles and policies that can be discussed in the third conference in Berlin in 2019. While we are here discussing, the courts, regulators, and private companies are already making decisions. Some will probably be adequate. But what is clear is that while there are not fair and satisfactory standards, everything is at risk. Many years ago, the UN Brundtland Commission elaborated a report on the protection of the environment. The report was called Our Common Future, and its slogan was the well-known phrase, think globally, act locally. I can't think of another expression that could better represent the challenge that lies ahead. Like the environment, the air, and the water, the internet is also global. And like the environment, the internet is also at risk. The judicial, regulatory, and private decisions have a ripple effect which we must bear in mind. The work we have done here and the work we face for the next 15 months is that of collective thinking about the principles, policies, and regulations that we are going to propose to protect the digital environment from the ripple effect of inadequate decisions. And this is only possible if we work jointly in our common digital future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your remarks, Catalina. Now I would like to give the floor to the Senior Director of Tech Policy of Microsoft, Paul Mitchell. You have the floor.
Well, thank you. And thanks to Bertrand and Paul and all of the support staff that have made this event run so smoothly. It's really been great so far. I want to focus just on a few things. And probably the most important is that to fully realize the benefits of the digital economy, sort of the advances in science, healthcare, climate science, artificial intelligence, etc., we actually need to bring all of our regulatory systems into the 21st century. And the Microsoft warrant case, which was argued yesterday at the US Supreme Court, clearly illustrates the point. Along with bringing our regulatory systems into the 21st century, we also have to reform cooperation mechanisms between countries. We all share a common interest in having a secure, predictable, safe cyberspace where human rights are protected. And this can only come from purposeful collaboration by stakeholders across the spectrum working together. This conference, incorporating government officials, technologists, rights activists, all working together on frameworks, which was the word of the week starting on Monday, it's a concrete start. To be clear, we all need a shared understanding of good governance on the internet, backed up by appropriate laws with due process and safeguards. From its inception, the Internet and Jurisdiction Project has had a lofty goal. And its initial work at cataloging and analyzing the various cases of jurisdictional conflict highlighted the work that would be needed. In Paris, I noted that we needed to move more quickly and move beyond cataloging and discussion towards action and implementation. And I think that's what we've done here today. It is easy to lose track of what's happening in the real world, however, when we engage in discussions such as what we've done this week. Microsoft engineers, and I'm sure those at Facebook, Amazon, Google, and others, are generally excited about working to put technology in service of making our lives better, connecting us more to each other, solving some of our most intractable human problems, and generally improving life. Our own corporate mission, for example, is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. And there are countless examples where our cloud technologies have dramatically improved lives and created opportunities in both the developed and developing worlds. And we are committed to doing so with full respect for human rights, and we recognize that governments have the responsibility to respect and protect human rights. Sadly, though, in addition to engineers at Microsoft, there are also actors who seek to use all of these tools for harm. We must ultimately be unified in our drive to address these harmful behaviors. While technology deployment is often disruptive, I believe the internet as a whole has brought remarkable good to the world, and for that reason, it's imperative that we double down on addressing the needed law and regulation. What we've done this week towards frameworks for action must move further and faster. And while we do this, I think it's important that we have a shared goal to actually enable the technology to be put into service. Our goal should be to facilitate technology working on our behalf to improve our lives and the planet we live on. We have repeatedly faced technology-based disruption, and as we've embraced it, we've raised productivity and prosperity in the past. Going forward, we have artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the Internet of Things. They all promise many exciting innovations we can't imagine yet. In yesterday's hearing on the Microsoft warrant case, Justice Ginsburg noted that all agree that in 1986 no one heard of the cloud. This type of search didn't exist. So the question is, what will be mainstream in 30 years that we haven't heard about yet? We will need to ask and answer many questions along the way and evolve our law and regulations so the frameworks that we set in place now must be flexible. They must allow those innovations to come to market, and yet they must also be durable. Even while we have been discussing these issues here in Ottawa, the world is moving ahead, with countries proposing new law and regulation to address domestically some of the issues affecting their societies. But these laws and regulations no longer have a simple implementation boundary. For example, the EU's General Data Protection Directive, which goes into effect in May, it will have a global impact as service providers like Microsoft attempt to figure out how to best comply with the law. And whatever decision the US Supreme Court ultimately makes in the warrant case will also have ripple effects around the world. The size of the stack of amicus filings, which is over 40 centimeters tall, as well as the number of parties filing, which was nearly 300, illustrates the high level of interest in the outcome that will eventually arise. And then there's the proposed US Cloud Act, which similarly will influence law and regulation outside of the United States. As the effect of each of these is felt, they will both inform and at the same time constrain the viable paths forward for governments around the world. So while we can work on frameworks here, we cannot lose sight of the fact that these frameworks ultimately must somehow be made operational. in law and regulation with standards that are agreed among the players in ways that protect human rights. It's difficult to comprehend the scale at which the internet is operating today. The sheer number of transactions, emails, and documents is staggering, and the burdens placed on service providers to address requests from law enforcement continue to increase. As a major cloud provider, we work on a daily basis to improve our services, remove illegal content, assist lawful investigations, and improve digital civility. But we continually face the challenge of conflicting laws and regulations, and in many cases, lack of clarity about what applies where. And this must be addressed urgently. The frameworks that we've started here have the potential to make a major contribution to addressing the issue if we can move them forward quickly and collaboratively, and if we can get the information we have produced into the right hands, and if we can successfully make the case for adoption of the proposals that we've drafted. We've discussed Berlin as a goal, but I think we actually need to make more concrete progress more quickly than that. In concluding, I'll just note the conference has assembled an impressive array of multi-stakeholder participants. The draft outputs have come a long way from where they started. As governments are actively considering new law and regulation now, we need to find ways to get these ideas into their deliberations now as they're happening, if our work is to have the greatest impact. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul, for those remarks. And now it is a tremendous pleasure to pass on, well, the virtual baton. There's no Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network flag yet. To Stefan Schnorr, who's the Director General for Digital Innovation Policy of the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy of the Government of Germany.
Yeah, Paul, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Now we are at the end of 3 days of very intensive and fruitful discussions. And first of all, I would like to thank you, Bertrand, and your team for organizing this very, very important event. And I also would like to thank the Canadian government, dear Deputy Minister Alan Castle, representative of the government today, for hosting it in that excellent meeting venue here in Shaw Centre in Ottawa. And let me thank also the moderators for your work yesterday. You make a great job. And thank you very much to all participants of the meetings and the constructive discussions yesterday and the very helpful contributions for the further work. We all learned a lot in the last days on how we better manage the internet, and that it is necessary that we act in common if we want to save the digital networks as they are open and global. The 3 work streams identified during the first meeting end of 2016 in Paris on creating frameworks for having access to data stored abroad, for dealing with domains, and how to treat illegal content are actually more relevant than ever, as the example of the current case of Microsoft, you mentioned it, shows. We came here together to discuss those highly relevant topics by following the well-established multi-stakeholder approach. That approach ensures the innovation and stability of the internet by taking into account a variety of perspectives and interests. The design of the digital future must be discussed from different perspectives in order to achieve good solutions. It's about a secure, open, robust and reliable internet for everyone. The German federal government very much likes to continue and to bring the debate forward among the multi-stakeholder approach. This is a reason why we have applied for the IGF 2019 to bring the discussions into the center of Europe to Berlin. As you all know, United Nations Under-Secretary General Leo Zenim has already confirmed that the event will take place in Berlin, in Germany's capital, from 26 to 29 November 2019. I am convinced that the Internet and Jurisdiction Conference here in Ottawa has been an important milestone on the way to the IGF 2019 in Berlin, and that it really helps to generate valuable input. Therefore, we proposed to hold the 3rd annual conference on the Internet of the Internet and Jurisdiction project in June 2019 in Berlin from 3rd to 5th June. And we are very proud to be able to host the conference, Bertrand, and thus make a contribution to the further development of the Internet. The Internet and Jurisdiction project is a long-term project, and it only can be successful with concrete outcomes that can be followed up after Ottawa. The more achievable results we get, the more intensive discussions on implementation will be. Germany is ready to pick up the momentum set by France and Canada, especially against the background of the IGF 2019 in Berlin. But now, the work is not done. We have to concretize our thoughts and ideas we gathered here and to make them implementable. So, before the next Global Internet and Jurisdiction Conference 2019 in Berlin, we need to further develop the existing work streams. And we should continue to exchange views and positions and to elaborate more defined documents with operational solutions. For that reason, I think it is useful to have at least one more physical meeting on expert level before the next conference, and Bertrand mentioned it in the morning. We would be happy and honored if Germany could also serve as a host for such a meeting. We are ready to host the expert meeting in our ministry in Berlin, and we are flexible about the right time slot. It could take place either in autumn this year, next winter, or early next year, whenever it seems to be adequate and necessary. In this sense, I look forward to the further good cooperation for concrete and direct usable results on results that help to maintain the free and open Internet. Very happy to see you all again, at least in Berlin, and thank you very much to all. Thank you.
Now that the virtual baton has been passed, it's the final moment for this conference. As we're not using rowing mics anymore, I want just to recognize the people who have so kindly circulated the mics as well. And I want to finish with just a few words beyond the deep gratitude that I have for all the kind words that have been said. Cynics will tell you that world history is about kings, wars, and establishing frontiers that separate people. I would encourage you to not believe that. Because as a matter of fact, if you take a little bit of a step back, you will realize that what world history is about is actually the constant effort of mankind to organize groups of people in larger and larger sizes. And that through, I would say, an unrelenting competition of ideas, of suggestions, of scientific explorations, and so on, and political proposals, they are basically trying to explain how the world works and how the societies can or should be organized. And so in this new phase, we are fundamentally confronted with a new step in this long historic arc from families to tribes to empires to regional dominions and to the nation-state system today. What is at stake is the question of how to organize the coexistence not of millions of people, not of hundreds of millions of people, but of billions of people in the same spaces. And if that were not enough, they are not just coming from nowhere. They all come from long-established traditions. And fundamentally, they have to learn to coexist quickly. I was discussing with a few of you, and a metaphor, you know I like metaphors, came to mind. If I traveled between Paris and Beijing by car or by train, especially by car, I will probably have no jet lag when I arrive. Because I will slowly adapt to one to the next. If I take a plane, on the other hand, as you all know, especially going in that direction, it's not good. What is happening is exactly the same thing. Human societies have adapted at scales that were at least decades and usually centuries. What we're confronted with here is the confrontation and the coexistence through those tools of groups of people that were not in contact with each other before. In many cases, it creates amazing sparks of creativity and innovation. And in other cases, it emboldens those who are trying to exploit the fractures that are already existing. And this can happen between countries, but it can happen within countries. I heard an expression a few days ago that really struck me. Somebody said, social media has made slander user-friendly. And it is scary. And I reminded a few people that there are consequences on daily life on what can be done to individuals, really. And the protection of human rights also is about the protection of the impact that things may have on individuals. So, in this context of great challenges, the digital revolution has impacted almost any activity. This is becoming a commonplace expression. And it's no surprise that it is impacting also policymaking, which means that this is about the new multi-stakeholder governance paradigm or approach, whatever you name it, can help improve the international system and how you and we collectively can make it happen. Final word, more than ever, I think that the quote that I have in my email is appropriate. There's no greater mission for humans than uniting humans. And I think this is a moment where we've tried to do this. With this, I hope that you will carry home the spirit of Ottawa as well as the Ottawa roadmap and bring it into your future encounters. And I thank you very much for having me here.
And with this, we officially close the second global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good way.